And we're back with another episode of Gladio for Europe. I am your host, Liam, joined here today by Russian Sam.
Hello, hello.
We are diving straight into Sicilian history with this one. So grab some hard cider, pretend you're not driving a car or listening on your phone, because it's not 2022 anymore. It is 1072. And we are in Palermo, capital of Muslim Sicily, and envy of the Mediterranean world. And the Norman warlords, Robert and Roger Ottvi, are just now meeting with the defeated emir of the city. In a scene immortalized by 18th century painter Giuseppe Pitania, the Lord of Palermo hands these two conquering brothers the keys to the Alcazar, the well-defended fortress just like the one famous in Islamic Spain. The emir does not know what fate awaits him. After all, these Normans are already infamous for their brutality, and especially their dishonor. Civilians peek over the windows to catch a glimpse of these strange foreigners, praying to God in Greek and Arabic that their lives are spared. This is a disaster for the people of Palermo, both Christian and Muslim alike, because their lives are now in the hands of these barbarians. But whatever the Normans have in store for the people of Palermo, a new chapter of Sicilian history has begun.
This week, we're going to continue our discussion on medieval Sicilian history, this time taking a deep dive into the Mediterranean Normans, the French-speaking knights who had turned the island into their own, while maintaining rather than destroying the cultures, technologies, and traditions introduced by the previous Arab rulers.
Exactly. We're going to follow the roller coaster of Sicilian history from the first arrival of the Normans on Italian shores to their eventual conquest of Palermo and the rest of the island. But to really understand the Normans, as you guys know from 2 episodes back, we have to start with the Vikings. As we discussed in our episode of Norman Origins, a group of Vikings settled in northwestern France in the early 10th century. There's a whole bunch of debate about to what extent these Normans that we're talking about in England and Sicily carried on much Scandinavian culture, but at the very least, they were understood as descendants from these pagan raiders who arrived a century before. There was this kind of stench of barbarism and foreignness that was nowhere as prominent as in southern Italy and the Islamic world, where we're now going to talk about these Normans being active. They really start to be active in Sicily in the late 10th century, but as our listeners know by now, their Viking ancestors got everywhere.
The Vikings really stepped foot everywhere where they could, and Sicily was naturally no exception. It took them a while to reach the edges of the known world, but within 50 years of the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, the Vikings were making their way to the Mediterranean, possibly even to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. And they really left their footprint, although unfortunately not in the archaeological record so much. If you go to the Madeira Islands today, which are formerly the property of Portugal, I believe, and you look at the mice, you'll discover that these aren't Iberian mice, these are rather Scandinavian mice. This is part of the genetics revolution, which is currently revolutionizing the field, so everyone is just DNA sequencing everything in sight.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Everything, even medieval mice bones, yeah. And probably more concrete is that we have a lot of Islamic records about Viking raids all across Islamic Spain. Famously, one group of Vikings would settle and become cheese makers in Spain. But what I found especially interesting, and I think that you dug this up, Russian Sam, is that Norse raids would continue in Spain all the way into the 1100s.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just as we talked about in our Northman episode, it took a while for state formation to really kick in Scandinavia. So these raids continued, not with the same intensity as had been the case in the 9th and 10th centuries, but nevertheless, there were always going to be young, hot-headed guys looking to make a name for themselves and to raid a bunch. So we know that the Norse were active in the Mediterranean, but there aren't that many records of them, and this is where we have to get to a caveat, really. Written attestation of the Norse in the Mediterranean is much more sparse than it is in the north. One proposed explanation for this is that the Mediterranean was already home to many Muslim pirates, whom the sources already referred to as Saracens.
Yeah, we mentioned a few of those guys in our last episode.
And as we'll see later on in this episode, they called the Vikings Saracens as well, because there was a lot of confusion about who these people are. Just like how Muslim sources refer to the Vikings as Majus, or the same word as Zoroastrians, the Magi. The Christians might have been confused about who exactly they were being raided by, and so some of these raids might have been labeled as Saracen rather than Norse. Yeah, one particularly entertaining example of this confusion comes from Dudo of St. Quentin, who wrote the history of the Normans, which we briefly mentioned in the Origins of the Normans episode a couple of weeks back. He opens the book by saying that the Vikings are Dacians, which are the people in the Balkans, modern-day Romania, basically. So
yeah, I think that was kind of a common kind of mistake, that because Dacian sounds a little bit like Danish, then multiple medieval historians thought there was some kind of connection there. But yeah, no, not at all. But I think maybe one of the most interesting parts about Dudo's chronicle is, besides the fact that he claims the Vikings only settled in Normandy as part of a secret Christian plan, was that he mentions a guy named Hastein, who's easily the most important Viking that we know of who was active in the Mediterranean, and has also been recently made somewhat famous due to the shows Vikings, as well as the game Crusader Kings 2.
So who was Hastein? He was honestly a bit of a mysterious figure. We know that he would have been born in approximately 810, and that he made his mark known in many different locales. His existence has been attested to in texts as disparate as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in Dudo of St. Quentin's work, and many more. He's also known as Hastings in some sources.
Yeah. Think of kind of like an early medieval Forrest Gump, who presumably killed a lot more people.
Oh yeah, but unlike Forrest Gump, Hastein did not have an amicable reputation at all. There's a lot of contradictory information out there about him, but nobody really has anything nice to say about him. But what we do know for sure is that he would have been raiding for decades from Britain all the way into the Mediterranean. As the story comes down to us, sometime around the year 859, he took his rather sizable fleet. One of the figures I came across is 62 ships. And just like the Germans are wont to do today, he went on vacation to the Mediterranean, raiding his way all the way from Iberia to Morocco and finally to Italy. What sets apart this particular raid from the others is that this is one of the few accounts of Viking raids in the region that have survived in several variants. So according to Dudo of St. Quentin, which again, you should take this with a grain of salt because he was basically hired to make the Normans look as nice as possible. The Vikings had plundered France so extensively that there was nothing left to take, and nobody could resist them militarily. So having gotten all that they could out of Francia, Hastein set his sights to the south, hoping to ultimately take control of Rome, which again, this is Dudo's account, but in reality was probably just another plundering raid.
But because Hastein wasn't that familiar with the Mediterranean, he got a little confused on the way to Rome. He came across a Ligurian town called Luni, which still exists today right between Genoa and Pisa. It's not exactly a big city, but its fortifications were so impressive that Hastein thought he'd finally reached Rome. Here is how another medieval source, History of the Dukes of Normandy and Kings of England, recounts the story.
He despaired and thought he would never be able to take it by assault. Then he sent his envoys to the count of the town and to its bishop. Most deceitfully, they declared their message. Hastein, our lord, who was born in Denmark and has brought us here by chance, we who have been in France and have done so much there that by force we have taken and destroyed it, had now decided to take us back to the place where we came from. But God would not allow it. Winds and storms were against us, who in tempest and in great fear and toil and very great distress have reached your land. We have not come to do harm, but we want peace, and most urgently do we ask for it. Our lord is ill, and he is still a Saracen. Now we ask in your charity to raise him from the font, for he wants to die a Christian, and if he dies here, he wants to be buried among you.
Let me just interject. Really interesting word choice to call him a Saracen. One thing I've read before is that there actually was this kind of medieval conspiracy theory that pagans and Muslims were all part of some shared anti-Christian plot, and this is an amazing example of that.
When the bishop and the count of the town heard these new words, they were delighted and gladly agreed, giving them all permission to come and go and to buy what they needed. Hastein had himself carried to the church, and the bishop raised him, and the count held him up to the font. Then he was carried back to a ship where he pretended to be very ill. The following night, he pretended to die, and his companions made such a show of grief that the townspeople thought he really was dead. Hasting had his men armed under their cloaks, and they carried him in a bier into the mother church. The count of the town was the most nobly dressed, and the bishop was robed to sing mass. Once Hasting knew that they were all assembled, he rose in full armor from the bier, killed first the bishop, then the count, and then all the other godparents he could find in the church. In this way, the town was taken and destroyed, and Hasting was delighted because he was sure he had conquered Rome. But when he discovered the truth, that this was certainly not Rome, he was very sad and told his men that he would lay the town waste. And so he did, as can still be seen, for the city still has no inhabitants. Then the Danes put back to sea. They did not dare go any further in case news of their treachery reached Rome.
Oh man, that is a great story.
Yeah, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like it was true necessarily in all of its details, at least.
Yeah, especially because, people did still live in Luni and still live there today.
But truth be told, at that time, Luni was already in very rough shape. Far from its earlier glory days, it was actually a city that came to prominence back during the days of the Roman Empire, actually. But what had happened was, because the Lombards had sacked the town and used its stones for other buildings, it was already in a very diminished state, and the Viking raid might have been what ultimately did the town in. But there's a big caveat here, really. If the town was already in such bad shape, then how could Hasting possibly have confused it for Rome? Maybe the significance of the raid was overrated? But although we don't know much, it seems like this raid was not entirely invented, because in another medieval chronicle, the Annals of St. Bertin, there is a mention of an 860 raid where, quote, the Danes who had been on the Rhone made for Italy, where they took Pisa and other civitates, sacked them, and laid them waste.
Right, and as we talked about, Luni is right next to Pisa.
There might have been a kernel of truth here, but Dudo naturally would have embellished the story. And actually, this was a bit of a trope of a Viking king pretending to be dead so he could be carried inside the city, only to then emerge out of his coffin armed. When I was reading the Julius Norwich book, The Normans of the South, he brings forth another anecdote where the same exact scenario happened, except in this case, the guy was lying on a bunch of swords in the coffin, so he just got up and when he did, like all his buddies got their swords and they got Viking.
That's great. Well, in any case, what this story about Hasting shows is that the Vikings were connected with the much wealthier Mediterranean world, and that once the Vikings would settle in France, a country which obviously has a Mediterranean coast, these connections would become even richer, ultimately leading to essentially permanent Norman habitation in southern Europe and even parts of the Middle East. Before we talk about the Normans proper, and I promise we're going to get there very soon, I want to mention another example of Norse contact with the Mediterranean, which is going to become very important in the second half of this episode, and that is the Varangian Guard. As I'm sure some of our listeners already know, the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, relied heavily on a mercenary guard of essentially Scandinavian Vikings, primarily recruited from the territories of the Rus, where these Vikings were incredibly active. Multiple runestones were erected back in Scandinavia that celebrate Viking activity all across the Mediterranean, but including in Italy, where this episode is going to focus on. They tend to be pretty vague, but they do have some interesting examples of things like Inga raised this stone in memory of Olafur, her son. He plowed his stern to the east and then met his end in the land of the Lombards. And in this case, Lombards probably means all Italians.
So just like the Franks came to be synonymous with Europeans, to the Vikings, the Lombards would have been synonymous with Italians.
Exactly, right. One interesting thing here is that Varangians seem to have mostly been Swedish, and all of the runestones we found that mention Viking activity in Italy are found in Sweden. But thing is, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, incredibly close to each other, and in the time period we're talking about, didn't exactly represent separate national identities yet. There is incredibly rich contact between Viking peoples all across Scandinavia, which would mean that any stories of Varangian activity in Italy would quickly be heard by people in Denmark. So here's a quick little example of what this kind of cultural contact might have looked like. Let's imagine two brothers growing up in the middle of Scandinavia in like 960. Their names are Eric and Gunnar, okay? So Eric and Gunnar grow up, they leave their family's farm, and decide to make their fortunes like so many young men and some women would do, as merchants or raiders or sailors, as Vikings. Eric rides a few days west to Norway and gets on a ship that takes him to the new Viking settlements in Normandy, France, whereas Gunnar walks a few days east to one of the trade ports on the Baltic and gets a job as a Varangian guard in Constantinople. Eric spends a few years working as a carpenter in France. He probably picks up some of the local language, but he feels like he's missing out on the kind of adventure he'd hoped to achieve. Then one day, a sailor walks into his shop. He's aged prematurely from weeks spent in the sun, and his face is obscured by a lattice of scars and a heavy beard. But this visitor is unmistakable. It's his brother, who tells Eric that Constantinople is filled with luxuries nobody back home could even comprehend. And what's more, his last job took him to the westernmost Byzantine territory, southern Italy, where the emperor had just reasserted Roman authority and is now overlooking the wealthy island of Sicily. Due to these kinds of contacts between Vikings and their descendants in Normandy, and with their trade partners and relatives serving with the Byzantines, it's most likely that this is how the Normans, who eventually became French speakers, learned about the wealth that was available in Sicily and southern Italy. And this is what would, around the year 1000, eventually bring these Normans to these lands, where it turns out they would never really leave. To really understand why and how the Normans settled in Sicily, we have to talk about the Hautevy family, founded by a minor landowner named Tancred de Hautevy, who is mostly well known for having a huge number of children. 14 that survived to adulthood, which even by medieval standards is incredible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the things that helped the Normans be so successful. They were very fruitful and multiplied, as the Bible insists that we all do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And so by the end of Tancred's life, his sons realized, probably because, there was so much competition between them, that they didn't have great prospects here in Normandy. Just like their Viking grandparents, it would make more sense for these guys to go abroad. So following the footsteps of our examples, Eric and Gunnar, the Tancred sons and daughters, who now have French names, all start venturing out into the ocean. By the end of the 10th century, we first start to see Normans appear in Italian and Byzantine records. The first clear reference dates to 999, in which a group of Norman pilgrims arrived at a famous shrine. The way that their descendants would put it was that when they got to this shrine, a group of Muslim pirates was trying to loot it, and these valiant Christian Normans jumped off of their ships, just like the Vikings would, ran up and, fought all these Saracens, and defended the people of Italy, and this shrine. I'm a little skeptical, because this is the Norman account, which is clearly trying to justify and legitimize Norman activity in Italy, but 999 does seem to be the year when this starts.
Yeah, John Norwich, he presents a much less dramatic version of the story, where they are on pilgrimage, at which point they strike up a conversation with the Lombard priest/nobleman who's telling them about the troubles that they're having with the Saracens. So they tell him, oh, we can't fight right now, we're on pilgrimage, but let us go back home, we'll assemble our men, and we'll come back to defend you.
Very shortly thereafter, small amounts of Normans would begin to come in. The first of these Normans, who actually I think even precedes any of the Hautevy family, but it's very much part of their story, was a guy named Rainulf Draenot. Just like Tancred, he was the son of a minor landowner who went abroad to seek his fortunes, and I think that his voyage abroad happened when his brother Gilbert committed some kind of violent crime and was brought before the Duke of Normandy. The Duke offered Gilbert either death or exile, which was a traditional choice that the Normans had inherited from the Vikings. Understandably, Gilbert chooses exile and brings his brother Rainulf along with him. Presumably, the Hautevy family who knew these guys, they were thinking, Italy, what's going on there? Rainulf is a smart guy, right? Like, he's got a reason for doing this. So this surely must have caught their eye.
So Gilbert and Rainulf, they arrived at the boot of the Italian peninsula to find it in a state of civil war. There was the Count Mello of Berry, who was rebelling against his Byzantine overlords, who already had some Normans in his service and knew that the Greeks did as well. So he thought that these newcomers would be a helpful addition to his retinue and an effective ally against their enemies. So Gilbert and Rainulf, they joined the ongoing revolt just in time to join an Italian charge against the Byzantines in the town of Cannae. But just like the first Battle of Cannae, this was an absolute disaster for the Italians. Mello's troops were crushed by the Byzantines, whose army included some Varangians from Sweden. During this fighting, Gilbert was killed, leaving Rainulf all alone in an unfamiliar country. When he made his way back to the rebel camp, he saw that the survivors had no idea whether to keep fighting or to make peace with the Byzantines. Even worse, the Count Mello was nowhere to be found. But as it turned out, instead of going back to camp, Mello threw in the towel and secretly fled to the safety of the Papal States, leaving his armies and his allies at the mercy of the much, much more powerful Greeks. Now that the rebels could only wait for the next Byzantine attack, knowing that defeat would most likely mean imprisonment, execution, or castration, Rainulf decided that he didn't really look forward to any of those options.
Instead, Rainulf convinced the other commanders that they should approach the Byzantines with an offer. These guys had no loyalty to Mello, especially that he'd run off on all of them. So, what if they offer to work for the Byzantines instead?
Yeah, again, at this point, these guys didn't have their own independent political ambitions. They were just sellswords going to the highest bidder.
Yeah, so Rainulf and a surviving brother, they start manning a castle in Apulia for Byzantine pay. But on the side, they make some extra money escorting pilgrims from all over Christendom, probably including a lot of Normans, to various holy sites, like the one that they had first had that encounter at. Due to this activity, they start bringing in other outcasts to join them. And this is where the Hautevys come into Sicily proper. They weren't the first ones there, but they started working for this guy, Rainulf, and ultimately would essentially take over his whole operation. Rainulf and his Hautevy comrades in 1022 successfully defended their castle from a failed attack by the Holy Roman Emperor, interestingly, but it seems like a source at the time suggests that the Holy Romans were somewhat impressed by these strange Normans' valor. Across the 1020s, while still in Byzantine service, Rainulf took advantage of constant conflicts between the Italian lords in Capua and Salerno to capture his own small city, Aversa, and declare himself as its count, and that essentially made him free of any Byzantine obligations. So suddenly with his capture, the Normans, in the form of Rainulf and his tiny retinue, have established themselves as their own government for the first time outside France.
Yeah, it's been theorized that by constantly switching sides across this decade, deliberately playing the local lords off of each other, Rainulf earned the Normans a reputation for dishonor that writers like Amadis of Monte Cassino, who would have been one of the main sources for Norman history in Italy, would blame on their barbarian heritage.
Right, but dishonorable or not, Rainulf would hold on to Aversa for another 10 years. During which time he married into the local nobility and, kind of interestingly, built a church with a whole bunch of Scandinavian-style art. But this isn't really Rainulf's story. This is really the story of his allies, the Hautevys, whose own conquest would greatly exceed Rainulf's. There were a whole bunch of Hautevys, like we mentioned, 14 of them, but the most important are William, Roger, Drogo, and especially Robert, later known as Robert the Fox, or perhaps better known by his Norman name, Robert Guiscard, which really means Robert the Wily, and wily he was.
So in 1038, Rainulf's one-time overlords, the Byzantines, that is, returned and they decided to set their sights on Sicily.
Right, and just as a reminder here, Sicily is still completely in Muslim hands in 1038. It was once the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire, but for the past 200 years, it has belonged to the Arabs.
So the Byzantines know who they're going to call, so they call up Rainulf and his new subjects, the Hauteville brothers, for service. Although Rainulf had abandoned the castle he was guarding for the Byzantines and is now supposed to be the subject of the Lord of Salerno, he realized that a military adventure in Sicily could be a really incredible opportunity. We're still not sure if the Normans had ever personally ventured across the straits, but due to close diplomatic and economic ties between Muscovy, Sicily, and the mainland, they would have known that this island was very wealthy and that it was ruled by so-called infidels.
Right. So the Byzantine lord George Maniakes, who we actually know mostly from a Norse saga, interestingly, would lead an attack to retake the Byzantine capital, Syracuse. Rainulf and the Otvis would be at the front of his army. Now, you might be wondering why this Italian Byzantine general is mentioned in a Norse saga. It's actually a pretty funny reason, if you want to explain this, Russian Sam.
As it turns out, one of his most trusted commanders was a little guy named Harold Hardrada, who was at this point a Varangian. But in just a couple of years, from 1046, I believe, he became the king of Norway. And he would later launch his own bid for the throne of England at the exact same time as the Normans. So again, we often have this impression of the Middle Ages as this very sleepy time when nobody really moved around much. But as you can see, there were a lot of hypermobile people out there who really just decided that they wanted to go sightseeing everywhere.
Yeah. So Harold Hardrada, George Maniakes, and the new Norman allies encircle the city of Syracuse and begin to starve out the inhabitants. One night, they see a group of Arab nobles trying to escape, including a man they recognize as the local emir. The Byzantines know that this guy is worth much more alive than dead, but the Norman William Oathby, not as sophisticated of a strategian. When he sees the guy he recognizes as the head of the enemy Muslim army escaping the city, William rushes up and kills him where he stands, earning him the name William Ironarm, but also robbing the Byzantines of a very valuable prisoner. With the city now defenseless, the Normans and Byzantines storm the gates and start to loot and plunder Syracuse. We don't know how violent the sack would have been, but come on, it's the Middle Ages. It can't have been that pleasant.
Oh, by the way, this story is great, actually, because the Byzantines had promised the inhabitants of the city that if they opened up their gates, then they wouldn't be plundered and they would be free to go on with their lives, just changing fealty over to the Byzantine side. But then as soon as they did open up the gates, the Normans just stormed in and started looting, saying that they never made such a promise.
Right. Yeah, no, you can see why they had this dishonorable reputation.
Yeah, absolutely. These were mercenaries in it for the love of the game, and the love of the game is raping and pillaging.
Right. And that is why, after the raping and pillaging had been done, George Maniakes and his lieutenant, Harald Hardrada, realized maybe they shouldn't be working with these Normans. Maybe these Normans aren't entitled to all the loot they had grabbed. So in a pretty common theme in Norman history, these established aristocratic forces who were working with the Normans instead decide to betray the Normans and refuse to give them the loot that the Normans had conquered. As a response, the Normans declare themselves once again free of any Byzantine obligations, and instead pledge themselves to the nearby counts of Benevento. If you can remember from the last episode, Benevento was notorious for being the most independently minded of all of the Italian states, especially because it saw itself as descended from the old Lombard kings of Italy. So to the Beneventans, both the Byzantines and the Holy Romans had no right being in Italy.
Rainulf, as we know from the sources, was an incredibly charismatic man, and he managed to convince the counts of Benevento that it was time to go to war against their old enemy, the Byzantines. And so he appointed William Ironarm as his general, who was now renowned across the Mediterranean for his ferocity, which again, he had just cut down the emir of Syracuse. At the shores of the Ofanto River in 1041, just outside of Cannae, a small group of a few hundred Norman cavalrymen waited for George Maniakes' much larger army, who were, again, these weren't fresh troops, they were very experienced Varangians, to meet them. Unfortunately, William had just come down with the fever, so he can't join the fight himself, but Rainulf is probably incredibly uneasy about his general being unable to command these troops directly. But William, he insists that he does have a plan. They just have to be patient and wait for the Greeks to arrive.
The Byzantine army finally gets to the river, and just as the Normans feared, it's primarily made up of Varangian veterans. But as soon as they start to cross the Ofanto River, William orders a cavalry charge, probably the first of a whole bunch of cavalry charges that would make the Normans famous all over Western Europe at this time. His cavalry pierced into the masses of the Varangian foot soldiers, knocking tons of them into the water before they can even reach dry land. In the chaos of the battle, Byzantine troops lose their footing in panic, dragged down the river in their heavy chainmail. Many of them must have started grabbing onto each other to keep their heads above water, gasping for air while dodging the lances of the Normans. Supposedly, the sick William was so excited from the sight of the slaughter that despite his fever, he rode down to personally take part in the killing. Again, they didn't call him Iron Arm for nothing.
And so Rainulf is watching all of this from on top of a hill. He has a bird's eye view of the battle, and he realizes that the much larger Byzantine army is being drowned right now. Back home in Scandinavia, the rune carvers were about to make a killing in monument sales because, rest in peace.
Yeah. This battle would really cement the Normans as one of the most important military players in southern Italy, even if they didn't really control much territory beyond the city of Aversa. William Ironarm also gained reputation as one of the region's most fearsome commanders, even if he wasn't really a guy you ever wanted to piss off. And as a result of this victory over the Byzantines, which nobody expected, many other local Italian cities joined Benevento in this revolt. And across the summer of 1041, Normans and their allies would humiliate the Byzantines again and again, capturing generals and bishops and exchanging them for huge ransoms that would fund their war machine.
But at this point, the Normans realize that they're running into a problem. They're still in the service of a coalition of Italian counts, which at this point is being led by a guy named Argyrus, who is the son of Mello, who, if you remember, was the cowardly Count of Beri who had left Rainulf for dead after losing the Battle of Cannae all the way back in 1018. As Normans are going to find out with Argyrus, the apple really doesn't fall far from the tree.
Right. Because while organizing a ransom with one of the Byzantine hostages, Argyrus basically takes the money and runs. He defects to Byzantine service, bringing with him most of the Italian army that the Normans had been fighting with. In return, he was given the totally meaningless title Duke of Italy, because by this point, there wasn't much Italian territory still controlled by the Byzantines. Needing new allies, the Normans had to turn to one of the last remaining lords of Italy who hadn't already betrayed them or been betrayed by them. And this was a guy named Duke Guaimar of Salerno, who was actually a relative of Argyrus, but turns out to be a much more reliable ally. Guaimar organized a marriage between William Ironarm and Guida, sister of his brother, named Guido, which I feel like is not a lot of originality in naming.
Well, they're assimilating to Roman customs, at least. And this marriage really would have been an enormous deal because it just goes to show how the Norman de Hauteville family are grafting themselves into the most established family in town. Although it should be noted that Guimar didn't really offer his daughter to these barbarians. Instead, he just offered the daughter of his brother, who happened to be the duke of the smallest duchy in all of Europe at the time. He knew that he could just push him around without having to worry about the repercussions. Regardless, this union of Lombard money and Norman iron would allow the joint Norman-Lombard territory to keep expanding. Now the Byzantines are on the back foot. The Normans can now quickly gobble up as many of the city-states in southern Italy as they could get their hands on.
The many different Hauteville brothers each got small realms to call their own, and most importantly, William Ironarm claimed Apulia. Rainulf, who, started this whole operation and is now getting up there in years, proclaimed himself to be the independent Duke of Gaeta, which, isn't bad for a landless exile who only came because his brother killed somebody back home.
Yeah, he's done pretty well for himself. But surprising nobody, the Byzantines weren't about to give up their territory without a fight. So in 1045, Argyrus, who again had switched sides and was now fighting for the Byzantines, launched his counterattack on Apulia, and this time Argyrus would catch the Normans off guard. During a skirmish, the great adventurer Rainulf Dregnot would be killed and William Ironarm was severely wounded. Because of this, the leadership passed on to William's brothers, Robert and Drogo. The Normans counterattacked and contained Argyrus to his father's old territory of Beri.
But meanwhile, during all of this, William Ironarm was dying. And not wanting his life and the life of his comrade Rainulf to have been spent in vain, William negotiated from his deathbed to shore up international support for the new Norman and Lombard territories in Italy. Most significantly, William declared himself and his brothers to be vassals of not the Byzantine Emperor, but instead the Holy Roman Emperor up in Germany. This way, they'd have some additional legitimacy for their dynasty and potentially also dissuade the Byzantines from attacking.
After William's death, his lands would be divided between his brothers Drogo and Humphrey, while the youngest brother, Robert Guiscard, would take on Renouf's nephew Richard to France to appeal for military assistance from his kinmen back home. Unfortunately, they didn't really get a great response because the Norman lords were already quite occupied in revolt against an 18-year-old upstart called Duke William the Bastard. If you'd like to hear about him some more, be sure to check out our episode 30, The Lion in Winter, where we talk about the Norman invasion of England for a bit.
Right. But due to the ambitions and activities of William the Bastard, Robert Guiscard was only able to return to Apulia with just a few dozen Norman knights. He meets with his brothers, Humphrey and Drogo, and asks, hey man, can you give me some land, after I went all that way? And they say no. Sorry man, we don't have that much. We really need all the territory we can get. Can you maybe just find your own land somewhere else?
Yeah, this seems very harsh, but there were very good reasons for them to snub their brothers like that. Namely, they already had a lot of knights in their own retinues who still hadn't gotten much land. So if they had just allowed Robert to jump ahead in the queue, they would suddenly find that there would be a lot of other disgruntled warriors.
Right, that was our last episode, the Aghlabids, the guys who would end up, the Muslims who would come to Sicily. They realized that you don't want to have a lot of warriors, hungry warriors in your court. The best thing to do with hungry warriors is to direct them into some kind of a conquest. And just like the Aghlabids, this is what Robert Guiscard will do, but he's maybe a little bit less elegant or sophisticated with how he chooses to grab some land.
So Robert, he takes his band of knights and he decides that he's going to become a bandit. He would become the scourge of the territories of the Lombards, the Byzantines, and the Normans alike, just getting a meal wherever he could. And it was around this time that he'd likely acquired his nickname Guiscard, or the Wily, or perhaps the Fox. And just like his brother William Ironarm, his stories would circulate far and wide across the Mediterranean, with all marveling at this fearsome outlaw lord. The famous Byzantine historian Anna Komnena would write about him. Robert was a man of immense stature, surpassing even the biggest men. He had a ruddy complexion, fair hair, broad shoulders, eyes that all but shot out sparks of fire. In a well-built man, one looks for breadth here and slimness there. In him, all was admirably well-proportioned and elegant. Homer remarked of Achilles that when he shouted, his hearers had the impression of a multitude in uproar, but Robert's bellows, so they say, put tens of thousands to flight.
Yeah, one of the original handsome generals, you could say. Hoping to placate his dangerous brother, Drogo offers Robert a tiny castle in his realm. But Robert says, you got anything bigger? And instead, forcibly seizes a better castle for himself. Now, he's styling himself as a lord, despite still totally being an outlaw. He decides it's time to settle down. So Robert Guiscard marries a woman named Albarada. She was a Norman who came from a powerful but not very wealthy or important family, who also had their own retinue of knights who might be able to help Robert. They probably only had a couple hundred fighters, but this was more than Robert had. So together, this marriage essentially gave him an army. Around this time, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry decided to visit his new vassal states in southern Italy. This was actually kind of a shock to the Normans, because coming all the way down from Germany was a huge and dangerous undertaking. Disease, death at sea, and the constant threat of warfare made these kinds of diplomatic missions a really big deal. But Henry and his wife Agnes met with the Normans, possibly even meeting Robert and Albarada, and touring the various territories of southern Italy. But while making a religious pilgrimage to Benevento, the famously independent city, they stopped at the exact same shrine that the Normans had visited in 999. And while they're visiting this shrine, the emperor and especially his wife Agnes, records mention, are heckled by a local mob of Beneventans. Clearly, Henry and Agnes are a tough crowd, because they're not going to deal with this kind of disrespect. So instead, they depose the local Count of Benevento and give this guy's land to the Normans, his new important allies. This allows Drogo to proclaim himself as a duke for the first time, just as Rainulf had done before him. Meanwhile, the spurned and evicted Lord of Benevento would escape to Rome to meet with the Pope, telling horror stories about the brutality and dishonor of these new Normans. I would bet that he made sure to mention that this new Duke Drogo happened to be the brother of Robert Guiscard, that infamous bandit everyone had heard of. And he certainly made sure to mention that these Normans were the grandchildren of Norse pagans, the kind of people who sacked Paris and burned bishops alive. Now they're just a few miles from the Vatican. It's like the Moors all over again.
Although this might sound strange to us today, this Pope, Leo IX, was actually a German nobleman. The tradition of the papacy being almost entirely monopolized by Italians hadn't taken root yet, so you really had popes from all over Europe at this point. He had trained as a warrior as a child, and he had close personal ties to the imperial family. In fact, that's how he got the post in the first place. It's quite likely that he was only sent to the priesthood by his cousin, who was the previous emperor, to remove a potentially ambitious rival from the competition.
Right. Just a little foreshadowing here. Removing someone from succession is going to be an important theme in this episode.
But after his cousin was succeeded by Emperor Henry, Leo made sure to ingratiate himself with the emperor and accompanied him everywhere. He was very good at schmoozing. So when the Pope decided that he was going to join the war against these troublesome crypto-pagans, he was sure that Henry would join him. But to his surprise, Henry said, "What, are you crazy? I just turned these guys into dukes, and you want me to turn against them? Don't you realize that these are the only people in Italy who actually want a German emperor running the show?" So the Pope, he was forced to organize his own ill-fated attempt to take the Normans on. He hired some German knights and then contacted the only person in Italy who hated the Normans more than he did, Argyrus, still Duke of Berry, still holed up in his good old fiefdom.
So the Pope brings his army of Swabian knights to the town of Civite, waiting for Argyrus' Byzantine forces to arrive. But, for reasons not entirely known, the Byzantine troops never got there. The theory I like, which multiple historians have brought forward, is that the reason the Byzantines didn't join this fight after all was because something was happening in Europe that was probably a lot more important even than the Normans settling in Sicily. What was happening right now was the Great Schism of Christianity, the East-West divide that would permanently sever these two ancient churches from one another. It seems possible that as these kind of tensions reached their height in 1053-1054, the soldiers serving under Argyrus told him, "Actually, you know what? If we're going to be fighting alongside the Pope, maybe let's sit that one out." And this means, with Argyrus gone, Pope Leo makes a crazy decision. Rather than call off the battle, he decides to organize it himself. He doesn't fight, like that would be a bridge too far, but he travels to the town of Civite and basically calls the shots from the city's walls, banking on his martial training when he was a young German princeling.
What happened afterwards was nothing less than one of the greatest disasters in papal history. Robert Guiscard and his cavalry totally crushed the Italian forces, while his brother Humphrey dealt with the Swabians, who were hardier than he had expected. But while Robert was chasing the fleeing Italians into the forest, he heard cries for help coming from his brother Humphrey's forces. While infantry typically lost their courage in the face of mounted cavalry, these Swabian footmen refused to break. Norman sources fearfully describe their brutality. Supposedly, these Swabians had the strength or the skill to kill a horse with one blow. Once its rider was down, they were able to split him in two from head to pelvis, which, I mean, I'm sure they were fine soldiers, but, this kind of has the vibe of a supervillain.
Yeah, again, these are the Norman sources, not the Swabian sources. I'm sure if you can find a Swabian chronicle, the Normans are probably fire-breathing, horned barbarians. But in any case, Robert rushes to Humphrey's aid, encircles the Swabians, and seems to basically slaughter them to a man. One thing that the Norman sources make sure to also mention is that Robert would actually get down from his horse and get back on several times, which I guess was seen as especially courageous and dangerous. Terrified at the courage and ferocity of these Normans, the inhabitants of the town of Civite would take matters into their own hands. They would drag Pope Leo out of the city and throw him out of the gates, leaving him at the Normans' mercy. just like the emir of Palermo, who we're going to get to later on. Luckily for the Pope, the Otvi brothers were too pious to harm a man of God. But they weren't above forcing the Bishop of Rome to legally recognize their lordship across most of southern Italy. Less than a year later, Pope Leo would die in disgrace, essentially being the reason that these barbaric Normans had solidified their control over southern Italy. Argyris would remain leader of the Byzantine forces for another 15 years, but the rest of his life would be marked by constant humiliation and defeat at the hands of the Normans.
It's interesting that all of these different actors keep promising the exact same plots of land to different people. How exactly, did they come to make all these claims?
That's a good question.
Well, essentially, there was this document called the Deed of Constantine, which, as it later turned out, there was a forgery, but essentially it said that for the rest of time, the Italian peninsula would belong to the church. It later turned out in the Middle Ages that this was actually a forgery, but at the time it was accepted as an actual document dating to the time of Constantine. So in this way, with all of these forgeries going around, you had no fewer than 2, 3, 4, 5 claimants to the throne of any one place all across Europe.
Right, that's really interesting. And, with or without any kind of claim at all, the Normans would continue their dominance over the Boot, and Robert Guiscard eventually would formally become count after the death of his brother Humphrey. Kind of funnily enough, as payback for being denied land by Humphrey years earlier, Robert made sure to screw Humphrey's intended heirs out of any land. So I guess they didn't call him the Fox for nothing. The Normans are about to reach new heights nobody would ever expect, thanks in part to the actions of the Pope. But this was an incredibly chaotic time for Christendom, and we gotta take a second to explain this.
This one really knocked my socks off. So we've talked about the Great Schism before on this podcast. You might remember in episode 32, Catholicism 101, we briefly touched on this. This schism was the reason that the Catholic and Orthodox churches are now totally separate branches of Christianity. But just to give a very condensed version of what happened, basically, Orthodox Christianity considered the Archbishop of Rome, in other words, the Pope, to be a first among equals, so to speak. In other words, he was to be accorded a special kind of respect because Jesus had said in the Bible that on this rock I shall build my church, referring to Rome. But in practice, his word was not supposed to count any more than that of any other archbishop.
Right, which we should mention is a huge divergence from the modern Orthodox Church, which, as far as I can tell, sees the Pope and any Catholic as essentially a heretic.
Really, the crux of the problem, aside from this first among equals bit, was that the Orthodox Church in general was much more pluricentric by this point, and important matters were supposed to be decided at synods through debates rather than by proclamation, which is what the Pope had taken to doing much more often. And you also had some doctrinal issues, such as the Filioque, which is the question of whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, which is the Orthodox position, or equally from the Son as well as the Father, the Catholic position.
Incredibly minute arguments about the Trinity is kind of like the free space on the bingo card of medieval Christian disputes.
Yeah, honestly, I don't understand the implications of this, even though I tried to. I really tried, but the Trinity is just too much for my feeble Jewish brain, unfortunately.
Sam, and by the way, your brain is anything but feeble. What does this crisis have to do with the subject of our episode, the Normans in Sicily?
Well, as it turns out, this crisis had been brewing for a while, and it probably would have erupted at some point or another. But the way that it happened in our timeline is that Norman activities in Italy directly provoked the incident which caused the schism. According to John Norwich in his book, The Normans in the South.
Yeah, it's very fun, very readable.
Argyris, who, again, is the Duke of Beri, who had defected from the Lombard cause over to the Byzantines. He was not on great terms with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who at this point would have been Michael Celarius. When Michael learned that Argyris had allied with the Roman Church to try to defeat the Normans, he decided that he was going to stir up some trouble because he had enough of these Romans and their silly heresies. So when news reached him that the Normans were imposing Latin rights onto their subjects, all with papal approval, by the way.
Right, and these subjects would have been Greek Rite Christians. It wasn't the churches hadn't exactly divided yet, but there was still this language dispute which had those complicated Trinitarian implications.
Yeah, and not just language. What was the crux of the issue here was the question of what kind of bread is used for the Eucharist. They were using unleavened bread, like the crackers you see today in Catholic ceremonies, whereas the Orthodox Church would use regular bread, apparently. So this was a big deal. It was really a huge faux pas. And Michael used this as an excuse to force Latin churches in Constantinople to adopt Greek rites in retaliation.
Oh, wow.
And the situation sort of spiraled out of control. There were angry letters going back and forth. In one letter that the Pope had sent to the Patriarch, Michael was being addressed as a bishop, which would have been a massive insult.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the Patriarch, and you're just calling him a run-of-the-mill bishop, of whom there are like dozens in any given country. But the emperor, when he found out what was going on, he attempted to put an end to all of this because there's a war going on. There are some really serious matters to be discussed, and now is not the time to start getting into theological disputes. So the emperor sent two very conciliatory letters penned in his name, as well as that of Michael, asking the Pope to come to meet in Constantinople to hammer out any issues that existed between the churches. This was an opening, but Pope Leo was still very bitter about what had happened, and his letters had a very passive-aggressive tone. But nevertheless, they did send a legation to Constantinople, which was really warmly greeted by the emperor. But they were being snubbed by the Patriarch, which they were really not having any of. And also, Pope Leo had actually died before the meeting with the Patriarch could be held, unbeknownst to the legation. But despite the fact that he was now dead and this legation was no longer valid because the new Pope would need to send a different one, the situation continued to escalate. Pope Leo's reply to a letter by a Bulgarian bishop criticizing the Roman Church doctrines was circulated, which had inspired a reply by another monk, which was taken very poorly by Humbert of Silva Candida, whom Leo had appointed to be the head of this legation.
This letter, though outspoken and occasionally clumsy, was couched in polite and respectful language, but it drew from Humbert, instead of a reasoned reply, a torrent of shrill, almost hysterical invective, ranting on page after page, describing Stephanus as a pestiferous pimp and a disciple of the malignant Muhammad, suggesting that he must have emerged from the theater or a brothel rather than a monastery, and finally pronouncing anathema upon him and all who shared his perverse doctrine. This extraordinary diatribe can only have confirmed the average Byzantine in an opinion that the Church of Rome was now little more than a collection of crude barbarians, with whom no agreement could ever be possible. And anathema in this context means excommunication, the big one.
Yeah, but this was not the end of the story. To put a massive cherry on top of this already shit Sunday, in July of 1054, during a Eucharist ceremony, Humbert entered the Hagia Sophia, which is the main church of Constantinople, which had excommunicated the Patriarch Michael, who would reciprocate the gesture a few days later.
No, this is the classic, right? You can't excommunicate me, I'm excommunicating you.
Yeah, yeah. So the funniest bit about this whole affair was that the Pope was now dead. And so, again, Humbert was no longer a representative of the Pope, and the excommunication held no validity. These excommunications were directed at individuals rather than entire churches, as is sometimes presented. So basically, this would have been just a scuffle between Michael the Patriarch and Humbert and the legation. But nevertheless, this schism was never healed despite attempts to mend it, and to this day, we still have two separate churches.
Right, and even within the Catholic Church, this was an incredibly turbulent time. And this is what really brings us back to the Normans right here. Because in 1059, there was a new pope, who was Pope Nicholas II. But he was elected after this unprecedented papal crisis that happened immediately after the Great Schism, because the pope before Nicholas had actually been enthroned in a coup by the notoriously sinful Count of Tusculum, and then removed in a counter-coup by the Duke of Tuscany.
Wow, we got a real Game of Thrones going on here, guys.
No, yeah, and if you want to learn about this whole period, especially within the Catholic Church, you're going to have to do it with your safe search on, because the name it's known by is actually the pornocracy. Not kidding. That's how sinful this time supposedly was.
What a time. What great history.
Yeah. Anyways, Nicholas II knew he was on very unsteady ground. His enemy, the Count of Tusculum, was right outside Rome, and he couldn't always count on the Duke of Tuscany to bail him out. So in a huge reversal of earlier papal policy, this new pope decided that they could no longer afford to be on hostile terms with the new Norman neighbors. Instead, Nicholas saw these barbarians as potential allies.
So the two sides met and they hammered out their terms. What came out of these negotiations would be the Treaty of Melfi. Under the terms of this treaty, Robert Guiscard, who was by now the powerful of all of the Norman counts in Italy, would be formally recognized by the Pope as the overlord of the southern third of the peninsula. He was proclaimed the Duke of Apulia and all the realms of southern Italy except for the allied Salerno, which was now his own vassal, essentially. In exchange for a promise to defend the Pope, Robert Guiscard was also given another ducal title, one that didn't reflect the reality on the ground, but rather his pure ambitions. He would become known as the Duke of Sicily, and he would work for decades to make this title a reality.
The second half of this episode is going to talk about what that would look like, and then eventually what would come after. But before we take our break here, I want to talk about what Robert would do to prepare for this holy war to capture this Muslim island. As we'd mentioned in a previous episode, Sicily had been controlled by Muslim forces for 200 years and had prospered in a lot of important ways during this time. It would be an incredible moral victory for Christendom and especially for the Normans if they could conquer this. But as part of Robert's preparations to invade, he would make one of his most controversial choices, at least among, modern historians looking back. And that he decided that if he really wants to take this powerful island, he'd first have to solidify his various relations with his new vassals, especially allied Salerno, whom he really relied on to make any kind of conquest. And Robert would do so in a surprisingly underhanded way. By now it's 1060, and Robert has risen to great heights since his early days as a bandit. But during this time, he's made a lot of unseemly alliances with figures who were now considered beneath him, the kind of bandits he would ride with, the various friends he'd bring into his court, and including his wife, Alborada, who was not from a noble family, but just a family that had some soldiers. So around the time that he was proclaimed Duke of Apulia and future Duke of Sicily, Robert Guiscard told the Pope that he wanted a divorce. This was almost unheard of in early medieval Christendom and would actually become completely illegal in the 13th century, giving us famously the Anglican Church of England. But in the 11th century, at this time, all you had to do was be friends with the Pope to get a divorce. You also had to get some kind of justification, and in this case, he explained that because he and Alborada were both Normans, they were actually distant cousins. And despite popular perceptions, in the Middle Ages, being married to a distant cousin could be grounds for divorce.
Yeah, and we're talking distant. I believe it was 7 generations.
Right, which is really far back. That's like everybody in a small town are 7th cousins.
Yeah, but of course the only people who had detailed genealogical records would have been nobles. So this wouldn't apply to most ordinary people, but if a noble suddenly found that he didn't enjoy being around his wife anymore, he could simply dig up the old family documents and say, "Oh, look, we're 6th cousins. Sorry, we can't be married."
Of course, there was one unusual thing about this divorce, which I wonder if it might have made the Pope initially hesitant to grant it, which was the fact that Robert and Alborada had 2 children. There's a lot of talk now about, children divorce, how it can be a very traumatizing experience. I think it had to have been about 1,000 times more traumatizing for medieval children whose parents were divorced. Because according to the bizarre stipulations of Catholic law, when a married couple became divorced, their previous marriage was essentially determined to no longer exist. What this means is that any children this now divorced couple might have had would now legally become bastards. So by divorcing his wife Alborada, Robert condemned his daughter Emma and his son Bohemund to illegitimacy. Suddenly, with a stroke of the pen, these 2 children lost any rights they had to inheritance of the Norman throne. They were now essentially less than full citizens. They were bastards. And he chose to do that to his own children because of his ambition. And I don't want to get too sentimental here, but, to me, I feel like this is just this incredibly illustrative moment about Robert's character. He's an interesting guy, and he's an impressive guy in some ways. Like so many medieval figures, he's not a good guy. He's not admirable. He cast his own family into the furnace of conquest. Robert Guiscard had just legally abandoned his own wife and children in order to arrange a more favorable match with the Duke of Salerno. Although we don't know as much about the Duke's daughter as I wish we did, she proved to be one of the most unusual and iconic people of her era. This woman's name was Sikelgaita. Sikelgaita is most famous today for potentially being the only woman in the entire Middle Ages to have directly commanded troops on the battlefield. A genuine warrior woman who operated in defiance against all of the gender norms of her time. She grew up in Salerno, which was home to the first medical school in Western Europe, and so later historians believe that she actually studied human physiology there to have a better understanding of how to kill people, whether by brute force or by poison. I think that medical school part might be an embellishment, but it is a really intriguing mystery why Sikelgaita was able to carve out this role for herself that very few other women in her time were able to do. Because really, she was fighting alongside her husband, Robert Guiscard, in full armor as part of the military. And there's a lot of stories about warrior women in mythology and in pop history, but Sikelgaita is actually one of the only confirmed cases that we actually have.
Yeah, and this isn't just a one-off story. It's been attested to in several different sources that she would have been on the battlefield wearing armor. And I think the wearing armor part might be the answer here, honestly. Like, she was very big, very muscular, so she would have had a much easier time with all that gear than the average woman of her time. John Norwich went as far as to say that, quote, "In her we come face to face with the closest approximation history has ever dared to produce of a Valkyrie. Or perhaps Shield Maiden. Although Shield Maidens actually are attested to archaeologically as well. But anyway, the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena, who represented an incredibly different model of medieval womanhood, admired Sikelgaita from afar, reporting that she wore her own suit of armor and had a lot of delight taking part in combat. Some modern writers compare Sikelgaita to a Valkyrie, but to Anna Komnena, there was another parallel to draw from. She called her another Athena.
Right, and because the story is so unusual, earlier generations of historians, who are overwhelmingly male, had no problem actually writing off her entire existence as a myth. But the thing is, like we mentioned, she's attested in multiple sources as having taken an active role in warfare. So I think it's almost certain that the Sikelgaita story is true.
It's just there's this very reflexive tendency to say just because warrior women wouldn't have been the norm in the past, that must mean that there weren't warrior women, period. When clearly, no, obviously there would have been times of great desperation when women would take up arms, and some women like Sikelgaita just would have done it for the love of the game, I suppose.
Right, yeah, no, I think that probably in every war since, 4000 BC, I'm sure many women have had active roles in combat. What's unusual about Sikelgaita is that she had a legitimate, permanent role as a commander. And that's what's unusual, and that is what a lot of earlier historians, I think, mistakenly had a hard time believing.
Right.
Even though Sikelgaita was about 20 years younger than her husband, it seems like she and Robert Guiscard were a pretty good match, because she was a really essential ally in planning and carrying out all of his conquests, especially in Sicily, as he's about to embark on. Many, many sources mention that wherever Robert went, she was at his side, on horseback, in armor, ready to plan and take part in whatever war he was about to fight.
This conquest would end up taking up the rest of Robert's life for the most part, and it had to be completed under his successors. Robert would never live to see the day when Sicily would be unified under his rule.
Right, but he would do the most important step, which was, as we mentioned in the beginning of this episode, taking the Arab capital of Palermo, which was this incredibly wealthy city and this really important center of Islamic learning in the 11th century.
Yeah, but how did he get there?
So he started in Messina, which, if anyone has ever seen a map of Sicily, that's right in the northeastern corner, right by the mainland, where he already had ruled. He got there in 1061, and it seems like he boarded a small invasion fleet and left under the cover of darkness. But when he got there, to his shock, the town of Messina was defenseless. As they secured the city, they learned from the local Greek-speaking residents that the reason the city had no defenses was because its ruler was currently engaged in a war against another leader. The two Islamic rulers were named Al-Timna and Al-Hawass. Russian Sam, can you tell us a little bit about how this strange feud started between the two of them?
Yes, as we mentioned previously, at this point, Sicily was no longer a united polity. There were now taifas on the island, little kingdoms, basically. And what had happened was that two of the most powerful kings, who would be Al-Timna and Al-Hawass, they got into a war, which, according to the Arab sources, started because Al-Timna had been married to the sister of Al-Hawass. So the two of them were brothers-in-law. But Al-Timna, he was not a great husband, to say the least. He got into a fight with his wife at some point and ordered his servants to grab her and slash her veins open during an argument, which resulted in her being spirited away by Al-Hawass, naturally, because this is an awful scenario, and no matter the way you dice it. And so this incident is allegedly what sparked this war.
Right, and the reason why it makes sense to be a little bit skeptical of this story is because Al-Timna, this terrible abusive husband, according to Islamic sources, would later go on to ally himself to the barbarian invader Robert. So I wouldn't be that surprised if that story of him being such a brutal husband was actually made up after the fact to explain why this, traitor who betrayed Sicily to Christendom was actually also a real, puppy kicker. In any case, it does seem like Al-Timna made some kind of alliance with Robert due to his ongoing war. I'm going to bet this is one of those classic blunders where you see some newcomers and you think, oh, perfect, there's more of us than there are of them. They can't be a threat at all. It'll be no problem if I use these guys to crush my enemies and maybe give them some land. Sometimes this gamble works, but many times it doesn't.
Al-Timna actually went farther than that. He told Robert that he would become his vassal and allow him to take the rest of Sicily if he would intervene in this war.
I'm a little bit skeptical of that part. I think that also might be, later demonization by Muslim writers, but maybe not. Maybe Al-Timna was so desperate that he would rather pledge himself underneath a Christian rather than let himself be defeated by his brother-in-law. What I find especially interesting about this, given the previous behavior of the Haute family, is that Robert said yes to this arrangement. Because remember, this is the brother of William Ironarm, the guy who essentially murdered an emir in cold blood rather than allow for any kind of negotiation with the Muslims. By now, Robert, despite his background as a brutal bandit, has become a lot more of a practical kind of conqueror. He's starting to realize that if he's going to be ruling in the future over a heavily Muslim population with existing Muslim power structures, he's going to need to work with these guys. And this is really, in my opinion, what makes the history of Norman Sicily so interesting. These constant layers of compromise and cooperation between Christians and Muslims that you don't usually see elsewhere in medieval European history.
Oh yeah, absolutely not. We'll get into the reasons why this might have been the case. It's not just pure altruism, I would argue.
Yes, we don't want to moralize here. I think this has practical motivations more than anything else, but at the very least, it's an interesting case. As soon as Robert and Sikelgaita got to Sicily and allied themselves with this emir, they started plundering multiple villages, and the main thing they wanted to bring back, interestingly, was cattle to feed their armies. They actually would start loading large amounts of cattle and horses on ships to go across the two sides of the Straits of Messina, which actually will kind of become important later on, the fact that they became quite good at transporting livestock. But as they were organizing one of these fleets of cattle to go back to Italy, the forces of Al-Hawass launched a surprise attack. Because half of the Norman army was already on the ships, they were totally caught by surprise. Robert had to order the ships that had already disembarked to go back to quickly do a 180 and return to Sicily so they could deal with this sudden onslaught of Muslim attackers. Eventually, the Normans would win the battle, but they'd suffer pretty devastating casualties. If that wasn't enough, when they eventually brought all the cattle and the surviving troops back to mainland Italy, they were greeted by a new invasion by the Byzantine Emperor.
Yeah, Normans, they wouldn't be able to return to Sicily for another 3 years because of that. And in this time, Robert, he'd be linking up with El Timna and leading his armies all the way to the walls of Palermo, which again was the largest city in Sicily. So the Normans, they would return to Sicily after 3 years after the Byzantine threat had been taken care of. And once again, they got to Viking, just raiding, pillaging. But this time, after Robert had already linked up with El Timna to continue the war and lead the armies to the walls of Palermo, they had to cut the invasion short because, as it turns out, El Hawes had a rather unusual ally. Apparently, the Tarantulas weren't big fans of the Normans for whatever reasons. As the medieval historian Geoffrey Malaterra, who is one of the main sources for Norman history in Italy, wrote, quote, "This tarantula is a worm which has the appearance of a spider but possesses a cruel and envenomed sting, such that those whom it attacks are forthwith filled with the most poisonous wind. Their distress increases till they are no longer able to contain this same wind, which comes forth noisily and indelicately from their backside, so that unless a hot compress or some other still more powerful calorific is at once applied, it is said that their very lives are at peril."
Right. So yeah, tarantulas, poisonous farters. Who knew?
I'm actually kind of skeptical. My impression was always that tarantulas aren't venomous at all. They're just scary looking.
Yeah, you know what I think happened? I think all these French guys, not used to the kind of subtropical environments, they see these giant bugs and just freak out and start running.
Yeah, that might make sense. I mean, if I saw tarantula for the first time, I definitely wouldn't.
Yeah, you can't blame them too much, yeah. Well, in any case, after the incident with the spiders, and, still wary from that previous ambush 3 years earlier, Robert talked to Sikelgaita, and they decided, we have to call this one off. So, thanks to this spider attack, they returned back again to mainland Italy, and guess what? What's happening one more time in Italy? You got it, another Byzantine invasion. Back to back.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
Right? Although it seems like this time the Byzantines might finally learn this lesson, because in the 1060s and early 1070s, the Byzantines would embark on their final attempt to really ever control Italy, marking the end of a 2,000-year history of Greek political dominance over parts of southern Italy. They'd give it a good shot, though, because the Byzantines would successfully retake many cities in Italy, and because Robert's army had been weakened by that ambush 3 years earlier, and I guess they were still shaken by the spiders, there was a real chance that he might lose this war. It wasn't going very well, and his real center of power were these cities on the mainland. If the Byzantines were able to take these cities, any ambitions of conquering Sicily would be gone. But an unexpected salvation would save Robert from this Byzantine attack. Possibly one of the strangest kinds of salvation possible.
Was this the Turks?
That's right, yeah. This was a little bit before the famous Battle of Manzikert itself, but raids from the Turkish Seljuk Empire would increasingly plague the eastern Byzantine frontier. They decided that this was such a serious threat that they eventually had to abandon any kind of Western ambitions. And in the middle of this war, all of the troops were recalled, bringing them back to eastern Anatolia to fight the Turks. Eventually, this would be in vain. In addition, although the arrival of these Turkish forces would save Robert from the Byzantine threat, a new threat, a Muslim threat, would be found on the other side. This would be the Zirids, a dynasty from mainland North Africa who technically controlled Sicily, but now for the first time were seriously attempting to reassert their power over the province. I wouldn't be surprised if they heard tell of the Muslim activities, the successful taking of Messina and the failed attempt to take Palermo, and the Zirids figured out, we have to, shore up our power here. Do you know much about the Zirids, Sam? I know that you've read a little bit about them.
I don't know that much, unfortunately. I just know that they were mostly centered around Tunisia. Basically, they took over after the Aghlabids were deposed, if I recall correctly.
Right, yeah. We talked all about them all about the Aghlabids last episode. Yeah, but I think that from what I understand, in general, the Zirids were not as effective necessarily at maintaining power, especially over Sicily, as the previous Aghlabids. And although this time, this invasion or, major defense would be their biggest attempt to stave off the Norman incursion.
So in an attempt to deal with this threat, Robert would dispatch his younger brother, Roger, on a reconnaissance mission to figure out just how big and powerful the Zirid army was. So a small posse of horsemen caught sight of the army outside of Menzil el-Emir. It's a name that literally means Inn of the Emir, like a place where you stay for the night, basically. But unfortunately for Robert, the Zirid army had noticed that there were these Normans creeping around too. So the Arabs, who were probably mostly on foot, unlike the mounted Normans, pursued the much smaller party of Normans over the hills of Italy. Although there were many more of them, because they were on foot, the Zirid's troops quickly tired themselves out. Roger was able to realize what was happening and suddenly ordered that his men turn around and charge into the exhausted Zirid army, utterly devastating them because, again, mounted cavalry going against an infantry is generally not a very successful recipe for an infantry victory in this period.
Right, yeah, and if anybody knows anything about, the history of Norman warfare all over Europe, cavalry charges were their calling card.
Yeah, so despite these unbelievable odds, the Normans came out on top in this battle, and Roger saw a group of carrier pigeons that had been brought by the Zirids from North Africa to communicate with capital of Palermo. So Roger, being a clever man, he decided that he was going to take one of these pigeons and tie a piece of parchment to its leg, a message which would be dipped in blood. It returned to Palermo with an ominous message to the Sicilian Arabs. The Normans were knocking.
That's right. And really, after this surprising victory over the much, much larger Zirid force, Robert realized he had an opening. And so it would take him a couple years to assemble a big enough army, but he knew that it would take so long for the Zirids to recover from these losses. And again, that was a battle they really should have won. He realized this was the time to strike. So on a brisk January morning, at the beginning of 1072, he organized an army of Normans, Italians, and local Greeks at his Sicilian toehold of Messina and boarded them onto a fleet headed to Palermo. Roger would be on this fleet himself, leading it, while Robert and Sikelgaita would march on horseback to Palermo. Essentially, a pincer attack by land and by sea.
But unfortunately, although the story with the pigeon makes for great storytelling, it doesn't make for a great strategy, because with this little trick, he had ensured that the element of surprise was no longer there. This meant that the Zirids would have had time to prepare for Roger's invasion. So when the fleet arrives at Palermo, hoping to charge straight through the harbor and quickly take the city, they see that chains had been erected across the harbor mouth to keep ships from coming inside.
Right. And this, for me, is one of the most interesting moments of the entire Norman story. Because when you see a giant chain blocking the mouth of the harbor, conventional wisdom says this is when you turn back to Messina. If you can't dock, then you have to give it up. But like many other Normans, Roger didn't want to take the easy option. He was a gambler. So against all better judgment, Roger, the brother of the great Robert Guiscard, orders his ships to charge into the harbor of Palermo, despite the giant chain blocking the way. You can imagine him, screaming at the oarsmen, these guys whose grandfathers had driven ships up the rivers of Russia, across the North Sea. They're not going to give up easily. The Sicilians are sending volley after volley of arrow toward the invading fleet, but Roger isn't daunted. Eventually, his ships crash against the massive chain. Wood splinters fly through the air. But somehow, a few of the ships make it across, and they've arrived in the great city of Palermo.
Yeah, it's not difficult to imagine the scene. It would have been incredibly chaotic. Ships and buildings would have been on fire. Again, this is medieval times, so everything's made out of wood. Very, very flammable. And the Normans, while all this is going on, are trying to unload hundreds of horses on the waterfront, while they're, of course, also being attacked by volley after volley of arrows. But nevertheless, once the army had disembarked, Roger sent a cavalry charge against Palermo's fortress, or Alcazar, in the middle of the crowded market district. This incident makes its way to us by way of Geoffrey of Malaterra, who reported that the Norman cavalry ran down the infantry who had gathered to defend the city, and they were just cutting them down. The survivors who were still alive were just banging on the doors of the fortress, pleading to be let inside, but the defenders just refused to open the gates out of fear that the Normans would follow them inside. So when the Normans reached the gates of the fortress, the fleeing defenders of the city were mercilessly slaughtered.
Yeah, you kind of got to wonder if any civilians might have gotten caught in the crossfire too. It definitely wasn't a good time to be living in Palermo.
Yeah, I mean, Normans weren't the most humanitarian of peoples, even by the standards of their day. So I could imagine that the civilian losses wouldn't have been out of the ordinary.
Right, and the only place where the Normans were not able to strike down these defenders was in the Alcazar itself, because it seems like this fortress was so well defended that it was essentially impenetrable. Roger ordered massive ladders to be brought to the fortress for his knights to climb up. The only entrance they could get into were the tiny windows where the Arab archers would lean out and shoot them. But this means that if you're trying to get in these windows, you're dodging arrows the entire time. One knight offered to try to get in there, who, brave or foolhardy, however you want to call it, that must have been a crazy mission. He climbs up the ladder alone just to get a glimpse of how many people are in the Alcazar, and as soon as he gets up there, he just slides back down the ladder. And he tells Roger that there's so many Arab defenders in the Alcazar that we can only get in there if you're willing to essentially sacrifice all of our lives. Roger saw that his men had taken a lot of casualties already, They already had essentially conquered the city, and they weren't sure how many lives they wanted to lose to take this last fortress. He also probably had to think, how am I going to tell my brother Robert, who's really leading this whole operation, that I just lost half of our army trying to take a single castle? So instead, Roger told his men to abandon their attack on the Alcazar and pull down the ladders, because he realized if as many men were defending this fortress as that knight said they were, then the rest of the city must be essentially undefended.
Yeah, and of course this would have included the walls of the city. So Roger sent a group of his men to the gates of Palermo and opened them up from the inside to allow Duke Robert to enter the city. The fox himself was finally inside this great Muslim capital with Sikelgaita by his side. Robert ordered that his men abandon the attack on the Alcazar and instead secure all of the mosques, churches, and great houses of the city in search for any prominent Arab officials who might make valuable hostages.
And again here, big divergence from the tactics of William Ironarm.
And so during the search that had been going on overnight, they managed to find several officials hiding. This probably would have included the Emir al-Hawass himself, but Christian sources, unfortunately, are not very clear on who it was.
Right. It's definitely more fun to imagine it was the guy whose civil war sort of led to this whole thing. Regardless of who this emir was, this brings us back to the start of the episode. Because now, the emir of Sicily, who probably technically considered himself the rightful ruler of the entire island, has prostrated him before these conquerors with the gathered judges, magnates, and notables of Palermo. And they are at Robert's mercy. But remarkably, because this is the Middle Ages, Robert chooses to show mercy. He tells his soldiers that there will be no more sacking of the city and no violence toward anybody, civilians or captured prisoners. Although the Normans could be cruel conquerors, the Sicilians would learn they could also be quite fair rulers. Instead of trying to destroy the society they had conquered, they wanted simply to rule it and get their cut.
So because of this, the inhabitants of Palermo, regardless of their faith, were largely spared. But what's even more remarkable is that he ordered that the city not be looted or sacked, which again was one of the main reasons why the Normans had been raiding up until this point. The promise of booty. They had broken with the army of Maniacus because they were told that they are not allowed to take booty.
Right. And now they're saying, all right, no booty at all.
Yes. So all the property that would have been held by the prosperous people of Palermo, such as the merchants and officials, all of that was supposed to remain in their hands. Roger only asked that the defenders of the Alcazar surrender themselves in exchange for the recognition of his overlordship. These Muslim local notables could even continue to run the city's affairs.
Right. And they took the deal. They gave Robert the keys to the Alcazar, and the Normans, to their credit, kept up their side of the bargain.
John Norwich, whom we quoted several times in this episode already, wrote, quote, "For the Saracens of Sicily, this marked the end of their political independence, but also the beginning of an age of unprecedented order and peace, during which, under the strong but benevolent central government, their artistic and scientific gifts would be encouraged and appreciated as never before. For the Normans, it became the foundation stone of their new political philosophy, enabling them to build up a state that for the next 100 years would stand to the world as an example of culture and enlightenment, giving them an understanding and breadth of outlook which was the envy of Europe."
As soon as they had fully captured the city, Robert and Sikelgaita rode across the streets of Palermo and visited an Orthodox church that had fallen into disrepair. The local priest, who was a Greek, not a Catholic, performed rites to celebrate their victory.
Yeah, this would have been only a couple of years after the schism would have happened, so many people probably didn't really fully grasp the implications. But to the Norman shock, there was a group of peasants that was arriving in from the countryside later that week to have an audience with the Duke. These people, they seem to have been Greeks as well as Arabs, were expressing their desire to join the Norman realm as long as they were promised the same deal that the people of Palermo had gotten.
So yeah, basically this means that all the lands around northwestern Sicily are joining this kingdom without a fight. Although Robert Guiscard would not live to see the entire island come under Norman domination, after the capture of Palermo, this sort of seemed like a foregone conclusion. The other cities still in Muslim hands were not as defensible, and it seemed unlikely that the Ziarids would be willing to embark on another expeditionary force anytime soon. And as Robert got older, he was already up there in years, he started planning for the final capture that would eventually happen a few years after his death, which would be the capture of Syracuse, the old Byzantine capital, and the city who the Byzantines would fail to have taken decades before in the war that first alerted the Normans to the wealth of Sicily.
Yeah, Robert, he would live for another 15 years, which was already pretty respectable for the time. I mean, he would have been already, in his 50s by this point?
Yeah. I think he was probably like in his 60s or early 70s when he died.
So in this time that he had left on this earth, the new pope would betray the agreement that Robert had made with Nicholas II himself, and he would lead the largest army of his career into Rome itself.
Right. Yeah. And so actually, interestingly, this relatively limited war between the papacy and the Normans would actually have a pretty exciting conclusion because it would lead to the city of Rome being captured. And there would be the first sack of the city since the time of the ancient Goths. This would also be the last sack of Rome up until the 16th century, when the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V would loot the city. I think it's kind of interesting that, he shows a lot more clemency to the Muslims of Palermo than he does to, the Catholics of the holiest city in Christianity, his own Catholic faith.
Well, he would have known that he didn't really stand a chance of actually conquering Rome, so he could probably afford to be a lot more cruel.
That's true, yeah. Robert eventually would go on one more overseas expedition to a place even farther out than Sicily, against really one of the most fearsome enemies in all of medieval Europe, even if they were no longer at their prime. He would end up dying on this expedition, which would be a failed invasion of the Byzantine Empire.
So, unfortunately for Robert, he would die during an ill-fated adventure into Byzantine Greece itself, some 15 years later. But he would have died fighting alongside not only Sikelgaita, his warrior wife, but also Bohemund, the son whom he had famously made a bastard some years before by choosing to marry Sikelgaita, thereby disinheriting Bohemund. This campaign would be a massive failure, but it also became famous because of its inclusion into the Byzantine history book, the Alexiad, written by Princess Anna Komnena, whom we had already quoted, which would have been based primarily on the war stories of her father, a rather famous Byzantine emperor, often considered one of the last great Byzantine emperors, Alexio Komnenos. And this would ensure that Robert, Bohemond, and Sikelgaita would all have their place in history in the written record of the Mediterranean.
Right. Bohemond, we should mention, would go on to have many adventures of his own after the death of his father. He would become one of the most interesting leaders, although perhaps not the most reliable leader, of the First Crusade. But I think that is going to have to wait till another episode later down the line, maybe a few months from now. We're going to finish this episode with a deep dive into what it was like to live in Norman Sicily, because this really was one of the most remarkable medieval societies. But before we get there, I want to turn back to one character we've just briefly mentioned, the Duchess of Sicily. And I don't mean Sikelgaita, the warrior queen, I mean Robert's first wife, who tends to get a lot less attention, Alborada. Just like Robert, she came from a humble background. She was just a wealthy Norman local who met Robert when he was so desperate for power that her family's small retinue of warriors could make his ambitions possible. He absolutely needed her in those early years. Eventually, of course, he would cast her aside, trade her in for a more desirable match. But what's pretty interesting about Alborada is that she doesn't disappear from history after this divorce. Instead, she remained at the Norman court, and by all accounts, she seemed to accept and understand the motivations for what Robert did to her. Because when Robert's body was brought back to Italy after this failed invasion of Greece, Alborada was the one who led the funeral arrangements, even though the two of them had been divorced for 27 years.
I mean, that's not even the craziest part of the story, really. As it turns out, Alborada would go on to live for another several decades, outliving two dukes of Sicily, both of her children, and even one of her grandchildren. She wouldn't die until 1122, when she might have been into her 90s.
Yeah, and what's crazy is that so she lived so long that she would see the kind of cultural transformations in Sicily that we're about to talk about. She was born in France, spent much of her life in Italy and Sicily, but by the time of her death, Sicily probably would have been unrecognizable to how Robert found it. She would see the Normans adopt these sophisticated systems of learning and diplomacy brought to the island initially by the Arabs, and she'd see this Norman culture of her youth turn into something new.
Yeah, and perhaps as a final mark of appreciation by the dynasty for everything that she had done for them, she would be buried in the Hauteville vault right next to Robert Guiscard. Her tomb was the only one that remained undisturbed for the past 900 years.
All right, so let's talk about what was this interesting culture and society that these people like Robert and Bohemond and Sikelgaita and Alborada lived in. Why exactly was Norman Sicily so unique?
Well, I'd say that it was incredibly diverse for an island of the size that it was. It was home to a vast cultural landscape composed of many different types of people. This would have included linguistic lines, so Arabic speakers, Berber speakers likely, Greek speakers and Romance speakers, religious lines. The Muslims would have been divided among the Sunnis and the Shiites, and the Christians among the Catholics and the Byzantines. And there were just many other divisions going on. But this entire society would be held together by a small class of French-speaking Normans who had increasingly distant Scandinavian origins, although they were quite proud of them.
Right. And we should mention that this really was a tiny class. There's no accurate demography of medieval Sicily, but I think it's unlikely that more than 10,000 Normans ever arrived from France. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was many fewer than that.
Yeah, what really shocked me is that Robert's initial invasion of Sicily would have included maybe a few hundred knights and an equivalent number of foot soldiers. And that's it. Really, those were all the Normans that made their way to Sicily.
Yeah, more people would come in from the continent, of course, but even when you include their servants and their family members and all that, yeah, we're talking probably low thousands. So this meant that it was a very small population of rulers scattered over a pretty large island. We talked about a similar a similar process happening when the Arabs first got there. How when all of these Arab troops who served under the Aghlabids arrived in Sicily, they had to cooperate in many ways with the local Greek inhabitants, and they eventually started adopting many aspects of the Byzantine high culture. Now, you're seeing the Normans do the exact same thing. They are inheriting this high culture of this blend of Arab and Byzantine traditions, and they're giving this new, strange French Viking spin on it.
Yes, and despite the fact that Sicily would have been incredibly diverse, it was still united as long as there was a strong ruler in charge.
Yeah, and this unity is kind of unusual, given that for so much of the previous century, Sicily had been fiercely divided and was constantly at war between various lesser nobles.
Yeah, but now, for now at least, the Normans had taken power, they had established their rule, and by all accounts, they did a pretty good job of it for decades. And because of this, all of these different elements of the population would have constantly been rubbing shoulders with each other. There's a travelogue written by an Arabic traveler named Amr ibn Jubayr, who basically writes extensively about what he saw during his visit to Norman Sicily in the years 1184/1185. But he talks about how basically in the city of Palermo, for example, which was the shining jewel of the Norman kingdom, you had Christian women speaking Arabic equally as fluently as their Muslim neighbors. They would have been dressed in the same kinds of clothing. They would have eaten the same kinds of food, more or less. So this goes to show that there was a deep syncretism present within the island. And this syncretism would come to affect the Normans themselves. Normans were, by this point, around 100 years removed from their Viking origins and becoming more and more distant by the generation. So over their time in the Mediterranean, they had to find new cultural modes to express themselves. And they would find this in the Arab and Greek cultures of the previous nobilities of Sicily, who were now pledging fealty to them. But nevertheless, there were still some hints of their Scandinavian heritage. The most interesting example of this would have been in the Aversa Cathedral, which we had mentioned earlier, which would have been commissioned by Rainulf, the first Norman lord in Italy.
Right, because so it's like many cathedrals, there's the kind of typical Christian iconography. One of these is, the depiction of St. George slaying a dragon. But what's so unusual about this depiction is that the craftsmanship is basically identical to Viking stone carvings. And the specific iconography of St. George and the Dragon is basically the same as Viking depictions of the hero Siegfried battling the dragon Fafnir. So you have an influence not only from Scandinavian culture, but specifically from Norse paganism, now lining the walls of this holy Catholic site in southern Italy.
Well, I'm sure that the local Catholics would have been holding on to remnants of Roman religion for their own decorations, so this would have been in the same mold, in the same tradition.
Yeah, but what it shows is that by the middle 11th century, which is basically the same time that Normans would conquer England, they still had some visible Scandinavian influence, And also it shows that they weren't ashamed of it, even as they were establishing themselves in Sicily. And again, Sicily seems to be where this Viking heritage was seen as most foreign. They were still totally fine with showing the world that they came from this tradition.
But rather uniquely for Christendom, these new Norman rulers paid Arab poets and musicians to make propaganda on their behalf, often using an Islamic language, motifs, even Quranic verses to legitimize their rule. Yeah,
which I think is just really remarkable.
Yeah, Liam, you dug up this quote from the Song of Roger.
Right, yeah. That's right, yeah. And it's by Muhammad Ali Idrisi, which again, this is using Quranic imagery and quotations to celebrate a Christian Norman ruler. Muhammad would write, "The venerated monarch Roger, empowered by Allah, ruler of Sicily, Italy, Lombardy, and Calabria, leader of the Roman Emperor, victor of the Christians, who rules with justice over his subjects, providing equal protection and welfare, and dispensing favors fairly. He who conducts himself with dignity, enacting laws in the most efficient and orderly manner, who, in conquering the territories of both East and West, humiliates all those among his co-religionists, near and far, who choose to act arrogantly. And he does so with vast and well-equipped armies and navies."
Yeah, this actually reminds me of another passage we read last time about Rollo, the Viking who founded the Norman dynasty.
Right, yeah, because our pal Dudo, he was a Christian celebrating a pre-Christian conqueror in Christian language. And this seems to be the kind of same process happening here. And so this brings me to, I think, one of the most interesting discussions that's happening now, even in contemporary scholarship, about the Normans, and particularly the Normans in Sicily, which is, to what extent can Norman activities in the High Middle Ages, such as, the conquest of England and the conquest of Sicily, be compared to the previous activities by their Viking forebearers? Is there a shared Norman tradition that goes from Rollo to Robert?
In his recent book, Dynasties Intertwined, Matt King wrote the following, quote, "As the Normans established hegemony in Sicily, they largely abandoned traditions from northern France or England when legitimizing their rule. Instead, they looked to the Byzantine East and the Muslim world as models for their regime, namely to the Fatimid courts of Egypt, with whom Normans had frequent contact."
Right. And so Matt King later uses this to suggest that these kinds of adoptions of Arab and Greek traditions suggest that the Normans were very different from their cousins in England and in Ireland, who were descended also from Rollo. But with all due respect, I kind of wonder if Matt might be missing another important parallel here. Because what this shows to me is that everywhere the Normans went, whether in England or Ireland or Wales, or in France or in Sicily, they showed a kind of cultural flexibility that wasn't really shared with other kinds of conquerors, especially not in places like Spain or eventually in the Holy Land, where Christians would also settle and expand. I gotta wonder if the reason why these Normans were always so fine with accepting foreign customs is because their own French customs were also quite recently acquired. They understood themselves not as Frenchmen, but as the children of Rollo, descendants of the Vikings. And I think that if that was their identity, if it was about this legendary heritage rather than any kind of French culture, that might explain why all kinds of Normans, as far off as the western fringes of Ireland, would be totally comfortable with wrapping themselves in the traditions of the peoples they were conquering.
Yeah, I would say that this holds true to some extent, but to push back on your pushing back on Matt King a little bit, I would say that this is quite a different situation in that the Normans and most of the Vikings would have become Christians during their tenure over these rulers, and the Sicilian Normans were Christians as well, whereas a very large portion of their subjects were Muslims, which was really unheard of in the Christian world, except for maybe a bit in Spain.
Although I think, from what I can tell, Muslims in Spain generally had a harder time of things than Muslims in Sicily under the Normans.
Yeah, where I would argue the Normans really stood out in Sicily is that they basically took upon themselves an Islamic style of ruling, rather than just looking to what other Christians were doing and the symbols of power that were being employed in the other places that they settled, which would have been based on a totally different framework as something legitimized by Christianity against something being legitimized by Islam.
Well, yeah, and I think this kind of, this little back and forth right here brings us to another important question about this whole topic, which was, to what extent is the reputation of toleration in Norman Sicily an accurate depiction of the society? And to what extent is it a myth by overly sympathetic later historians?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun thinking about this, but before we begin, I have to lay out some terms here. For the purpose of this discussion, I found this definition of toleration that I quite liked, which is when the agent holds negative judgment about something, and the agent has the power to negate this thing, and yet the agent deliberately refrains from negation. So let's take a silly example. I'm a despot, I have unlimited power, and I just really hate pineapple pizza. But I allow my subjects to consume it anyway because, I'm enlightened. I'm tolerating what I consider to be a bad practice. I might even go as far as to say as it's immoral, but I tolerate it. So what does that really say about me? It could be that I'm just really committed to freedom of expression because I am the product of a mode of thinking that's post-Enlightenment that values these kinds of judgments. Or, more likely, I'd say, especially in periods of the past as far away as this one, I'm allowing my subjects to partake in this distasteful but harmless mode of expression because I only have a limited amount of political capital and goodwill that I can use up before the people start grumbling and potentially overthrow me, which really gets to the idea of toleration as a control mechanism. Yeah, because we live in a very moralistic culture, there is this idea that toleration is a good in and of itself. And of course, I believe that it is, but nevertheless, I don't think that it really requires any degree of personal goodness. So the most famous example in the last couple of years would be this kerfuffle about so-called woke capital, HR departments, diversity, equity, inclusion, that kind of stuff.
Right, yeah, and it's like the right-wing attitude is that, corporations are woke, they're the ones behind all of this. Whereas I think a much more practical approach would be these corporations are wrapping themselves in progressive rhetoric to endear themselves to their customers and their employees who like that.
Yeah, so it may not be so much that these corporations and people who run them like certain kinds of people per se. It's more that they recognize that cooperation can be beneficial for both parties.
Right. And yes, and in somewhere like medieval Sicily, cooperation was totally necessary because, as you mentioned, it was a really, really diverse place. Sam, I think you dug up some kind of attempts to guess the religious demographics of the island at this time.
Yeah, around 1050, the island would have been approximately 40% Muslim, 40% Christian, and then another 10% Jewish. This is only a very rough guesstimate, really. We don't have great sources from that period, as far as I've been able to tell. But as I mentioned previously, even within these groupings, you would have had a large number of divisions between the speakers of different languages, the practitioners of different kinds of religions, people occupying different social niches.
Right. And as we mentioned, these often would intersect in some ways you might not expect, like how we know that there were Arabic-speaking Christians living in Sicily at this time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I guess the main crux of the issue here is that there are very, very few Normans in Sicily at this time. They're moving into a land that's home to all of these different communities as outsiders, mind you. And so there's just a very limited amount of actions that could be taken that wouldn't disturb their rule. So just to give you guys an idea of how few of them there would have been, the Normans had only 250 to 300 knights and around the same number of infantrymen when they were staging their invasion of Sicily.
And again, we mentioned last episode, Palermo itself, just a single city, was probably already in a population in the 6 digits by this point.
Yeah, I believe I saw the figure of 350,000.
Right. So yeah, and that's just one city on an island with multiple significant cities.
So basically, this tiny group of people is faced with this dilemma where they have to, find a modus operandi that both legitimizes their rule and maintains a delicate balance between all of these group interests.
So it makes sense that if you're not in the mood to, constantly be dealing with rebellions from every sector of your diverse population, you're going to have to give a lot of leeway to their cultural and religious practices. But what exactly did this leeway look like? How did toleration proceed in Sicily?
So as we mentioned, in 1072, when Palermo surrendered to Roger's forces, they were able to secure promises that they would not be subjected to new and oppressive laws, that they would be allowed to practice their customs and their faith, provided they are not in contradiction with laws passed by the Normans, and other communities would have gotten similar deals. And this is a caveat here. There was not one overarching, organ that spoke for all of the Muslims of Sicily or all of the Catholics of Italy. So basically, as Roger went along conquering different parts of Sicily, he would have to make agreements with these communities on a case-by-case basis. But nevertheless, it seems like the Normans were very successful at placating the worries of these people, that they would be able to continue to live their lives in safety, that they wouldn't be persecuted for their religion. And consequently, the Normans were able to use this toleration to great advantage. One example that I found from the historian Lupus Protopatharius wrote that Roger's army included 20,000 so-called Saracen soldiers during the siege of Amalfi in the 1090s.
Right. And what I think is even more interesting than that is the fact that the Norman administration was not anything imposed from the top down like you see somewhere, for instance, in the later Crusader states. Instead, the Normans adopted this pre-existing fief system developed by both the Byzantines and the later Arabs. The same population and tax registers used by the Arabs continued to be used in Greek and Arabic, not in Norman French. Even though it seems like initially there weren't that many Muslim administrators in the government, there were far more Greeks involved than Normans. And eventually, during the reign of Roger II, which is kind of beyond the scope of this episode, they would actually move the capital of the Norman state from southern Italy to Sicily, to Palermo.
Yeah, the historian Ibn al-Athir even reports that there were rumors circulating that Roger II was a secret Muslim because of how much respect he showed for the culture and the way he conducted himself around Muslims. So if I were a Muslim living under a Christian ruler at the beginning of the 12th century, there are definitely places that would have been a lot worse for me than Norman Sicily. Right.
But I guess nevertheless, of course, things weren't all sunshine and roses.
Yeah, so again, I mentioned that the Normans had largely taken on an Islamic style of ruling, and this included something very similar to the jizya tax, which is a tax paid by non-Muslims living under Muslim rule to the treasury in exchange for not having to do military service. And the Kingdom of Norman Sicily seemed to develop an institution similar to the jizya, where non-Christians were subjected to additional taxes. And of course, these taxes seem to have hit the poorest people the hardest. This wasn't really out of step with the times. And it seems like there were increasing intercommunal tensions as Roger II died and his son, William I, took over. William wasn't a very strong ruler. He, in fact, outsourced a lot of his rule to a minister named Mayo, I believe it was, who ended up being assassinated by some disgruntled nobles.
And, I kind of have to wonder if part of why these tensions erupted during his rule was that increasingly more and more Italian Christians from mainland Italy would be settling on Sicily. And this meant that the Muslims, who had been about 40% of the population at the start of the Norman era, were now probably an increasingly slim minority who no longer were as essential to running this society as they once were.
And also just it seems like the pie was getting smaller while the number of claimants was getting bigger. So at a certain point, you're just going to want to scapegoat some certain people. And if those people don't believe in the same God as you do, for example, that seems like a convenient pretext.
Ibn al-Jubair, who is usually cited to express the toleration of Norman Sicily, also mentions that across the Norman era, increasing numbers of Muslims chose to convert to Christianity or to keep their Muslim identity under wraps. And I have to think this was happening under some kind of, social duress.
Yeah. Something I found particularly funny reading Ibn al-Jubair's book is that he divides it into his sojourns into different cities, basically. So every section is titled after the city, and before he begins the text proper, he writes, "May God restore to the Muslims."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's like, so again, like even if you're not going to be persecuted for your faith, you might still prefer to live in a Muslim country, essentially, if you're a Muslim.
Yeah. So as we mentioned previously, the Muslim population began declining from the second half of the 12th century onwards, seemingly in response to these increasing persecutions, which speaks to really the apparent tolerance of the Norman government versus the intolerance of the people under him. Which again, Ibn al-Jubair has nothing but positive things to say about the king of Sicily at this point. He was a man who took the Arabic language seriously. He knew it. He wrote in it. He read in it, and he seemed to respect the Muslims who surrounded him. It's just one guy isn't going to do it when things get bad enough. Yeah, so I guess to wrap this up, I'd say that Normans were tolerant by the standards of the time, but But there are very good practical reasons for why they would have been so. It wasn't because they were particularly nice. This overlaps very closely with what Muslim rulers of the time would have been doing. So this is not even really unprecedented. Maybe it's a bit unprecedented in Christendom, but not in the region.
Right. And I think that this is kind of one of the most interesting consequences of the entire Norman era, is that they would bring Sicily back into the fold of Christendom. Sicily would be very prosperous under the Normans, it would be remarkably tolerant, but eventually it would slowly become more in line with other Christian states, which would have very unfortunate repercussions for the non-Christians of the island, especially once the Normans had been replaced by other Christian dynasties. One of the interesting long-term trends here is this kind of demographic shift that happened in Sicily, where Italian dialects that had previously not been spoken on the island at all would become dominant at the expense of Greek and Arabic. One thing we should mention is that so modern-day Sicilian is spoken all across the island, although these days standard Italian is increasingly common, but both of these languages are closely related. At the time that the Normans arrived in Sicily, it doesn't seem likely that there were really any communities at all speaking the Sicilian language. Although some Sicilian historians and nationalists try to insist that the Sicilian language goes all the way back to Roman times, that probably isn't the case. Instead, the Sicilian language was introduced by medieval colonists from Calabria, who were invited by the Normans to settle on their wealthy island. When the Arabs first got to Sicily, it seems that the island was pretty much entirely Greek-speaking. But after the 11th century, many more Romance speakers come with the Normans. We should mention that these Romance speakers came from pretty diverse backgrounds themselves, because not all of these migrants from Italy spoke Calabrian or Sicilian. A lot of them, strangely, came from northern Italy or even the south of France, and they brought some kind of dialect closest to the modern language Occitan of southern France, which is actually still spoken today in isolated communities in Sicily. It's kind of mistakenly called Sicilian Lombard sometimes. Linguists call it Sicilian Gallo-Italic, because it's probably not actually related to, or closely related to, Lombard of Italy. But it's still spoken. And it appears that in the Norman era, this language, this Gallo-Italic, Northern Italian, Southern French language, was probably the most prestigious language spoken by Catholics. It wasn't exactly French, but it was closer to French than to modern Italian. And it was probably mutually intelligible with the kind of French that the Normans spoke. I would not be surprised if, over the decades, as the Normans became increasingly acculturated in the local tradition of Sicily, if the French that they spoke became much more southern. You know, they started saying "ok" instead of "we," which was the famous division. But eventually, due to later political changes in Sicily, the Calabrian language would become the standard and eventually would simply be known as Sicilian.
And speaking of language, Norman Sicily would actually become one of the places where texts were transmitted into Latin from Greek and Arabic sources. There were quite a few translations undertaken in Norman Sicily, medical works being among them. As we mentioned, Salerno was home to the first medical school within Europe. And the Arabs had a bit of a edge over Europeans at this time when it came to medical texts. So in the 11th century, you had the translation of an Arabic medical textbook.
Right, and remember that Salerno, which was the close ally and eventual vassal of the Normans, that had the biggest and oldest medical school in the Catholic West.
And greater topics were enjoyed as well. So, for example, the Arabic compilation of stories, Akalila wa Dimna, was translated from Arabic into Greek at this time under Norman patronage. Yeah, so it would have been part of the medley of myths circulating in the Mediterranean at this time, thanks to the efforts of the Normans.
Yeah, and you mentioned Roger II, a later Norman duke who is even suspected of being a secret Muslim. He actually would learn Arabic to speak with his Muslim nobles. And as we mentioned, there was also a Christian Arab population, or at least Arabic speaking. This population no longer exists. Due to later activities by first Germans running Sicily, and then even the Spanish in the early modern period, non-Italian languages would essentially be eradicated, especially when the Spanish in 1493 would expel Jews and later Muslims from their country. This most famously had its repercussions in the south of Spain, where ancient Jewish communities were pushed elsewhere into North Africa and Europe. But because Sicily was part of the Spanish Dominion at this time, it was part of the Kingdom of Aragon, Sicilian Jews and Muslims were expelled as well, thus essentially getting rid of both Arabic, which was heavily spoken, as well as Greek, because Greek was the language of the Sicilian Jews. But we should mention that there's one strange little holdout of Arabic in Sicily.
That would be Maltese. Not Sicily, but close enough.
We mentioned this in our last episode. We have to go over it again. But they seem to speak a language that was kind of an extension of the Arabic of Sicily. And the Maltese are incredibly Catholic today, so they had a language shift underneath the period of Arab rule. But then when the Normans got there, they had a religion shift too, and they all converted. So it's kind of interesting. Basically, so that wraps it up. It's been a long one. This has been a fun one, talking all about the really incredible and unusual adventures of the Normans in Sicily, both how they would get to this island and what they would do once they got there. I really feel like this is a pretty important event for the entire history of the Mediterranean, because this would mean that Sicily, this incredibly strategically valuable island, would now basically forever be part of the Christian orbit. And this was never inevitable. A lot of histories, even as late as in the 20th century, seem to see that Muslim rule over Sicily, Arab rule over Sicily, was some kind of aberration, and it was only natural that Europeans would once again control the island. But that isn't true, History doesn't work that way. There aren't these kind of inevitable trends. The only reason why Sicily is part of Europe today and not part of North Africa is because of the incredible ambitions and remarkable luck of these Normans.
So what are some other legacies of Norman conquest?
You talked about, there's the translation of Arabic texts, these kinds of increased connections with the Middle East, but not all of these were necessarily positive ramifications, especially for the Muslims themselves, including Muslims overseas. Later on, Normans would briefly attempt to take over North Africa, and I think that they even control the area of Tunis for a little bit. But I think that the most significant effect, or at least the most significant negative ramification from the perspective of Muslims of this conquest, is that the conquest of Sicily showed Western Christians that the, supposed encroaching Muslim hordes were not necessarily invincible. Christians could push into Muslim territory, and that is what is going to happen across the next, really, 3 centuries, not only in the Middle East, but also in Spain. And Muslims in these areas would have a much worse experience than Muslims living in Sicily. I think that in the future, we're probably going to have to do an episode on the First Crusade, especially because so many Mormons, but particularly Bohemond, would be leaders themselves. And I think it's interesting that in the research I've done so far, the Normans did seem to bring kind of a touch of toleration to the crusade that was completely rejected by all other crusaders. It's just a very interesting subject. And like we mentioned at the top of this episode, it really shows that the medieval world was incredibly connected in ways that we might not now assume.
Yeah, and speaking of connection, one of the rather surprising connections that I came across, again, from Norwich's book, is that it's been hypothesized that the entire reason why William the Conqueror's invasion of England was possible in the first place was because the Normans had gotten a lot of expertise in bringing knights across water in this period as they were invading Sicily. So
right. And animals as well, because the conquest of both Sicily and England totally relied on these Norman cavalry charges.
Well, I guess that about does it for this week's episode. Thank you once again for listening to Gladio Free Europe. And if you like what we're doing and would like to bring more content, please give us a helping hand. Please go to Spotify or iTunes and give us a rating and or a review.
Right. Yes. Yeah, we love feedback. Yeah. And hey, if anybody wants to suggest a topic if anybody knows a potential good guest who might know about a particularly interesting period of history, anywhere from, the Neolithic to modern times. Hit us up, drop us a line.
If you are said good guest.
Yes, yeah, if you are a guest, come on. Yeah, we love having our buddies on Gladio for Europe. This was a long one. This was a fun one. I really hope you enjoyed hearing our 3-part series now on the Normans. They are, I think, one of the most remarkable cultures in medieval history. And I gotta say, I can't wait to follow in their footsteps and visit Sicily one day, because this place seems gorgeous. But no conquest, okay?
I can't promise anything, but I'll try to be on my best behavior.
All right, well, this has been Gladio for Europe, signing off.